welcome to what promises to be a really wonderful talk today. I'm Maite Green Mercado, and I am the Newark Campus Director for the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, which brings together a wide group of scholars and students across the university who are committed to the study of race and racial justice. This group of students and faculty do so from different disciplinary and scholarly perspectives across time and space, and from our city, state, country, and globally. So I want to welcome you all to the Race and Religion series for the spring semester 2024 at ISGRJ-Newark, which centers conversations about the intersections of race and religion and the racialization of religion from historical and contemporary perspectives in the US and globally. As categories of identity and identification, race and religion have historically overlapped and competed as primary forms of differentiation and markers of difference. In collaboration with the Islam, the Humanities, and the Human Working Group, this winter-spring series will focus on Islam in Africa. One of the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade was that West African Muslims preceded much of the rest of the Muslim world in their confrontation with imperial power, market economies, and the moral questions they engendered. With European colonization and the subsequent processes of decolonization, the tensions between discriminating hierarchies of race and the moral commitments of religion conditioned conflicting ways of imagining community and group membership. In this lecture series for this semester, we will host 3 scholars who will contribute to our archival understanding and textual appreciation of these global circuits of difference. And I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Wendell Marsh, who will talk a little bit about the Islam, the Humanities, and the Human Working Group, and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Maite, for the introduction, and thank you so much for your enthusiasm for this series and exploring this topic, which of course for me is near and dear to my own heart and set of interests. So thank you very much for that. I think we're going to have a great series of conversations over the course of this semester. So just a word about the Islam, the Humanities, and the Human Working Group. So often when we talk about the humanities, we might imagine some reference to Western civilization, to antiquity, to medieval Europe. But if we think of the humanities, as many have, as responding to the question, what does it mean to be human? We have to concede that these ideas that associate the humanities with a secular, elite, Western, and masculine association is not quite right? And given our present context, the humanities remain, despite this historic association, a vitally necessary space to develop attitudes that moderate techno-scientific approaches to the world and to promote critical thought in a climate where truth and even the possibility of social life are under threat. There's a vexing quandary between the humanities' kind of origins and kind of master narratives of origins and its ongoing and vital role in today's global society. So our working group, Islam, the Humanities, and the Human, employs the diversity of the history of Islam, of Muslim societies, and artistic expressions as a way to transform the humanities. So with it, we have been facilitating faculty conversations, invited outside speakers like we're doing today, and are developing curricular interventions that would be of a broad interest. Our group believes that the future of the humanities depends upon its radical reconfiguration, a transformation that must be achieved through an estrangement of the humanities from itself. And so by that, what we mean is that recognizing, for example, that the disciplines that we call the humanities today partly have their origins in the history of Islamic thought. That the grammars of humanistic expression and interpretation, visual material cultures have important intersections with Islam, colonialism, the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and much more. So we approach these themes outside of any normative frameworks of religious belief, but also beyond the constraints of kind of disciplinary and area studies frameworks. So, and instead, we focus on the meaning-making processes that take Islam both as a foundation and from a critical perspective, those that take Islam as a counterpoint for thinking. So that's the working group. We kind of took shape following a series of hires in 2017, 2018, in a number of disciplines and fields. And with the support of our chancellor, our beloved chancellor, Nancy Cantor, who has generously supported our activities for a number of years now, extending that support to the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies minor. We've been working in this domain. Now to introduce our guest speaker today, Madina Thiam, Dr. Madina Thiam, who is an assistant professor at New York University in the history department. I am really beyond thrilled to have her here at Rutgers-Newark. We first met, I think, in Dakar long enough ago. You know, in the course of doing research and work, and I've really been impressed and admire your growth as a scholar since that point. And you all should remember, you listened to a talk of hers here, because she's really a leading rising light in African history. And so Dr. Thiam is kind of works in 19th and 20th century African history, African diasporic history, with an emphasis on colonization, decolonization, nationalisms. She has published many peer-reviewed works, including what has to be one of the best encyclopedia entries I've ever read on women in Mali. It's just so kind of thorough, but yet still thoughtful. It does a lot more than just kind of present the facts about the subject matter. She's working on a manuscript, The Inland Shore, and the Intimate History of Revolution and Decolonization in Muslim West Africa, which is a much anticipated work. I could absolutely spend a lot more time introducing her and her work and why it's so interesting for us here with the Islam and the Humanities and the Human Working Group, and also the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, and for Rutgers-Newark more broadly, but she could do it much better than I. So with that in mind, Dr. Thiam will present the talk, The Black Writer in a World in the Revolution, William Allen Brown and the Study of Islam in West Africa. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna need to make sure to keep myself on time. Not necessarily known to do well, so I'll count on you, Maite, maybe to wave at me if you see me starting going too long. First of all, thank you so much, everyone today for showing up. I'm really honored and humbled, to have everybody in the room. I want to thank the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice for putting all of this together. Terry Cooper-Smith for taking care of literally everything and making sure that the whole visit went really smoothly, and it really did. So thank you. I also wanted to thank Christina Strasberger, who's not able to make it, but who also was very helpful in the past 2 days. Maite, of course, we've been talking about this for a little while now, and I'm just so glad to, see it all coming together, and really honored to be here, sincerely, and to be part of this really exciting lineup also that you have for this series of talks. And thanks, Wendell, for inviting me. Yeah, as you said, we met like a few years ago now. I think it must have been 2018 or something. The first time we did, as you had finished, and as I was, a graduate student in the middle of the constant cycle of panic and stress that is graduate school. I don't know how else to describe it. And I just really wanted to tell you that, since then, you've really embodied for me a model of, intellectual rigor, intellectual integrity, but also generosity and enthusiasm. And always being reminded that, we do this because it's fun, but also because we really need to study. And that's, that's something that I very much hope to emulate in the years to come. So yeah, thank you for being around and for organizing this. All right, I'll jump into things. And this talk might be slightly less structured than I would have wanted it to be. But this is I think we have a good size of crowd that, I'll try to leave a lot of space for discussion, conversation, questions, and hopefully develop from there. What I'm going to talk about today is new work that does not stem out of my monograph in progress, but actually stems out of an opportunity I had a few months ago to write about a scholar that is not necessarily a very well-known name in the broader profession. His name was William Allen Brown. He was a scholar, he was a professor and a historian of 19th century West Africa who taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He did not keep a high profile, and in fact, it seems that he displayed a serious aversion even towards overexposure and keeping that kind of high profile, so much so that I don't have a picture of him to show you today. I have a picture of his dissertation, which is the work that, the few of us who study this region of Mali, this is the work that we know him by. But I really struggled, including yesterday, emailing several people who I knew were his former students to ask them if they had any picture of them. And that turned out to be complicated. So this is William Brown, or at least how he presented himself to us, right? He's the author of an important work, which is this PhD dissertation on the Caliphate of Hamdoulaye, which was a 19th century theocratic state that had once stood in the country that is today Mali in West Africa, in a region of Mali named Mopti. And I'll go into this a little bit more in detail later. But what I want to focus on today is not so much this PhD dissertation as the circumstances, the global circumstances that surrounded the production of this work. And think a little bit about the path of William Brown as a student, first an undergraduate student and then a graduate student in the 1960s, in a time of, global revolution across the Black world, where it seems for him, this struggle, these political struggles that were taking place in the United States, in West Africa, and the importance of study and of studying, the Muslim past of West Africa came hand in hand, and we're on two, parallel tracks, or intertwined tracks rather. And so that's what I'll talk about a little bit. So first, a little bit more on William Brown. William Allen Brown is his full name, was born on January 29th, 1934 in North Carolina. He grew up in New York City, in Harlem and the Bronx, and after a quick stint in the US Air Force, he enrolled at Kentucky State College, the state's oldest HBCU, historically Black college. And he graduated from Kentucky State College in 1959 with a degree in history and government and French. halfway through his studies in that school, when he was around 23 years old, he was a sophomore student then at Kentucky State College. On June 2nd, 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. came to the college to deliver the commencement speech that year. So the event was, if you think back about the time period, the event was occurring in the midst of the civil rights movement on the heels of the grueling Montgomery bus boycott, which had drawn international attention to that part of the country and to the United States in general. And so as a rising junior, Brown in principle would not have been able to attend this commencement ceremony, except as this newspaper excerpt and other excerpts from the time period make clear, pretty much the entire college population and a large segment of the city's Black population came out that day to listen to MLK's speech. It didn't end up just being a graduation speech. So it drew that huge crowd that he was, we might speculate, likely part of. If he was not there that day, that's surely an event that would have been a defining moment of his college time and his college career. And in that particular speech, King, so it was right after the Montgomery bus boycott. It was also 1957, right after the independence of Ghana, the country in West Africa. And King had just returned from the independence festivities from Ghana. And so he gave that speech, that address, entitled Facing the Challenge of a New Age, where he talked about, how domestic struggles in the United States were in fact intimately connected to global fights against colonialism and imperialism. And he stressed that the students, people such as Brown, were, quote, living in one of the most momentous periods of human history in which a new social order is being born, end of quote. So whether or not Brown was in the crowd that day, it is certain that his visit would have been a seminal event, that King's visit would have been a seminal event in his college experience. And that particular speech talking about the struggles in the domestically and struggles abroad would have been debated, discussed, and dissected by all the students for months following the visit. And it seems that it might have had an impact, or at least one of several factors that had an impact. Indeed, within a few years, of the speech taking place, Brown graduated from the college. He graduated as a valedictorian. And as I said, he had studied French history and government. He kept studying African history, kept studying the French language, kept studying the Arabic language, and eventually made his way to Africa. So that was the atmosphere in which he came of age as a student, in the late 1950s. After graduating from this place, he attends the Sorbonne University in Paris, France, on a Fulbright fellowship. And then in 1960, he starts graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied history and African studies. So for his dissertation at Wisconsin-Madison, Brown decided to study the history of Islam in West Africa. And particularly over time, his studies specifically focused on a particular episode of West African history, which was the rise of a relatively short-lived Muslim state between 1818 and 1862 in the central regions of what was today Mali. This was at a time where you had a lot of studies being, that started being carried out about a wave of revolutionary movements and Islamic states that had risen in 19th century West Africa. But that particular place that Brown decides to study is one of the lesser known among these movements. And is one of the less studied. And that's the kind of work that he decides to take on. He studies this for Madison, and then he does, as one has to do, travels to go do his field work, his field research. And so it's in that context that in 1965, he touches down in the city of Bamako, which is the capital city of Mali. And 1965 was an interesting place, an interesting time, sorry, to be in Bamako. Like the MLK in his graduation speech had told the students that, that their age was like an exciting age filled with hope and at the intersection of two worlds, the dying old and the emerging new. And I think one of the places where this dying old world and emerging new world was the most visible in the 1960s was Bamako, Mali. It's not necessarily one of the best known sort of like, global capitals of the third world and of anti-imperialism, on that time period. I think people more readily think about Accra in Ghana, about Algiers, which is definitely a crossroads of revolution, or even Dar es Salaam in East Africa and Tanzania, of course. But in Bamako too, actually, you had a lot of these revolutionary and anti-imperialist energies converging right at the time when he arrived. Bamako was a Pan-African metropolis. It was a crossroads of the Algerian and the South African liberation movements. Frantz Fanon had traveled there in 1960 to seek support for the Algerian Revolution. Nelson Mandela was there in 1962 for similar reasons. In 1963, Ahmed Ben Bella, the president of Algeria, and Hassan II, the king of Morocco, agreed to meet in Bamako to put an end to the Moroccan-Algeria war that was brewing. So you had a lot of these kind of like intersections, brokerage of different conflicts, people just traveling there, from all over the continent. The year that Brown arrived in Mali, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, for example, was in the city as well, as part of efforts to curtail a growing divide between former French colonies and former British colonies, even just in that region of West Africa. So there was that energy in Bamako, and I'm convinced that Brown felt it, right? This is a picture of the city that he took, by the way. This photo, along with others, are available now on the University of Wisconsin libraries, online repositories. They have a number of photographs that Brown took in various parts of West Africa during his travel. And I really love it, right? Because it's a great way to also see, or at least for us to imagine and put ourselves in our shoes as he walked the streets of that city. And, this is like a bird's eye view. You also see various pictures that he took just literally at a, street level of, I don't know, barbershops, street sellers, all of these things. So you can imagine as a young student, who has been studying this place for a while, and this is finally the time that you get there, when a lot of things are happening. And indeed, a lot of things are happening in Bamako in the mid-1960s. You have a colossal, like, Soviet-designed Olympic stadium that is being erected at the foot of the Kuluba Hill that you see in the back of the photo. You have various international presence of various international teams who are helping the Malian state with a variety of things, really just transforming the city in an attempt to transform the state, that will quickly be curtailed. In 1968, there's a coup in Mali that puts an end to a lot of this dynamic. But this is the moment where, where he was there, Brown was there himself. But of course, he had not just come to Mali to experience Pan-Africanism and experience the revolutionary fervor of the 60s right as it was happening, right? He was there to study, he was there to work, he was there to research. And so he did. And to do that, he left Bamako, went to another region of the country. So you see Bamako roughly here on the map, but the place that he was interested in studying was in that broad region, in that place right on and around the river that is called the Delta, in and around a city named Mopti in Mali. And what he did there was very important, is that he learned directly alongside with and at the feet of Malian scholars and intellectuals, different types of scholars and intellectuals who had been very active in this region. The first one that he met was a man named Almami Maliki Yatara. And I think, this is a picture of that city in Mopti, again, taken by Brown in the 60s. And you see the different types of environment that he found himself in. And those are some of the people that he encountered when in Mali, right? The first one here, Almami Maliki Yatara, is not the most well-known Malian scholar, including in Mali today. His heritage is not as permanent. He was one of these scholars working with the National Humanities Institute, who was often tasked with guiding the research of foreign academics who would come to Mali at the time. And as was the case for many such scholars, their contribution was often kind of like downplayed in the later work that you see published by these other people. But with Brown, it's not the case. In fact, Maliki Yattara publishes himself memoirs, you know, of his life and of the various people he encountered. He published these memoirs, I want to say, in the early 2000s. And he devotes an entire chapter to the time he spent with William Brown, which is really not something that he does with the other scholars, much bigger names now in the study of Islam in Africa that he also encountered. But he discussed the close relationship that they kept, both in Mali, but also after Brown left, their correspondence that carried on for years until it was abruptly ended. You know, decades later. But you really see the close relationship that they had, and you really see the impact that Yattara had on Brown's approach to studying the Caliphate of Hamdallah, the state that he had come to there to study. They traveled together across that region, you know, towards the cities of Ségou, of Djenné, Mopti that I was talking about, of Bandiagara, of Timbuktu, the well-known city in that part of Mali, and a lot of villages and towns in between, you know, following these geographies of 19th century Muslim revolutions in West Africa, and collecting knowledge from a number of actors, both oral knowledge in the form of oral tradition and written, and I'll explain that in a minute, and written knowledge in the form of manuscripts, most of them written in the Arabic language, that they, you know, went around and collected from a number of places. So a big part of the research that they did together indeed consisted in oral interviews with local scholars, custodians and crafters of oral histories, descendants, as well as descendants from various lineages associated with the Caliphate of Hamdallah. In total, in his dissertation, Brown lists 45 individuals he interviewed in Ségou, Mopti, Sévaré, and so on and so forth, in Timbuktu. But also, the work was not just based on these oral histories. It was also, you know, based on the manuscripts that existed in abundance in the region, and that Brown was one of the first outsiders or foreigners in that time period of the 60s to really tap into, to craft his scholarly work. And so in addition to the oral interviews, Brown lists, you know, over 70 Arabic manuscripts that he consulted in the course of his dissertation research and writing. These came from libraries, of course, in Mali, but also in other places in Nigeria, in Senegal, in France, in Morocco also. And so where I really see the impact of these Malian scholars that Brown meets, it's in his fusion really of, you know, this interweaving of oral knowledge and written knowledge in reconstructing African history. For people who are not necessarily familiar, this has for a long time been kind of like a, you know, one of the seminal, on the one hand, debates, but also contributions of historians of Africa, really explaining and relying, you know, elaborating methods for working with oral histories, oral traditions, oral knowledge, because there's often that idea of Africa being a continent, you know, with little written tradition. But actually what, you know, what these Malian scholars knew very well, and what Brown also does, was that both traditions existed hand in hand, right? This transmission of knowledge orally, but also in writing. And so he does both. He does both with Almami Maliki Yattara, who guides and facilitates much of his research. And Yattara himself was a scholar versed in the Fulani language, in the Arabic language, in the French language, and moved easily between oral history interviews and the copying of manuscripts, which is something that they spent a lot of time doing. There were other scholars, Sidi Mohammed Abdoulaye Boul Aref of Timbuktu, who was a retired Arabic teacher and the son of a famous bibliophile, and who provided them with a lot of manuscripts as well about the local and regional history of Mopti and of the Caliphate of Hamdallah. Other scholars, Amadou Ampateba, that you see here in the middle, is probably the best known intellectual from Mali. You know, who's known for a lot of things. One of the main one is being the, you know, the author of that quote about how when an elder dies, a library burns. That's not actually how we phrased it, but I think people found a way of, you know, crafting it better afterwards. But that's also somebody that Brown engaged with. We know they had personal communications and that Brown obtained information directly from him. he engaged with the work of Ibrahim Mamadou Wan, which is the author on the cover of that book that you see on the upper left corner, who had one of the most extensive libraries in Bamako, who had studied Arabic and Muslim theology and law in the French educational system in Mali, and had published a number of works, including this, including one specifically on the caliphate that Brown had come to study. Other scholars, Mambi Sidibé, I could not fit everybody in there. Yeru Archulula, who was like a Fulani bard, a griot, as you know, they're often known. And so who was mostly known for his performances. Here, this is a screenshot from like one of the early performances on Malian public TV that he does. But actually, this is somebody who, like Brown, had also traveled all across the region to collect as many oral traditions and manuscripts as he could and craft the type of performances and songs that he would publish, that he would then perform on Malian TV. So you really see Brown now as part of a network of scholars already doing that work in Mali and really inscribing himself in that dynamic. And he recognizes it and he thanks them, right? In his dissertation, that's one of the first thing that he sees is that after, as usual, as you thank a lot of people, but that the first depth of gratitude for him really goes to the people of Mali, both the scholars, but also the various people that he met, alongside his travel, who really shaped the work that he did. And so after all that period of 1964, 1965, there might be another few trips, immediately after. I'm still kind of reconstructing his specific trajectory in Mali. But what we know is that by 1968, though, Brown is back to the United States. He's writing his dissertation. He did the research, he collected information. It's time to sit down and write now. But it is 1968. And so he's back, a Black student on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. In 68, at a key juncture where the politics of knowledge production by people of African descent and for people of African descent were being hotly contested. So in May and August 1968, William Brown organized two conferences on his Madison campus. The first one was a conference on Afro-American letters and art, which he put together, quote, brilliantly and almost single-handedly. That's what one of his professors said at the time. And the second one, of which you see the proceedings on the screen, was a two-day symposium on militant Black writers in the United States and Africa that he decided to organize. It's a work that he put together. And anybody who has written a dissertation knows that when you're in the middle of doing that, it's kind of hard to take on other tasks, such as organizing everything. But he ran around, he's the one who looked for support, including financial support, looked for speakers, and put this whole thing together as he was in the final stage of the PhD research. Probably a busy and stressful period. What was the impetus behind this organizing? So if you step back a little bit, in 1968, on university campuses across the United States, what Robin Kelley has called an epistemic revolution was underway. And calls were spreading for the development of Black studies. So what was Black studies? It was an interdisciplinary project rooted in the struggle against inequalities and exploitations based on racial, class, and gender hierarchies. And Black studies also emphasized the ways Black people had historically sought to dismantle those hierarchies and imagined just ways of organizing society. And so on Brown's campus in Madison, by the month of May 1968, just 1 month after the assassination of MLK, pressure was growing from the student body. For, a dismantling of these hierarchies and overall just merging both the revolutionary politics and the impetus for a specific type of epistemology, adopting Black studies more centrally. It wasn't just in Madison, right? It was in universities across the United States. Wendell just told me the other day, we were just at Conklin Hall right now, and you told me about students liberating the hall. I don't remember which year. Was it in 68 as well? 69. 69. This is happening all over this is happening in many campuses across the country. And it's in that context that Brown recently returned from Mali and from West Africa, both from Bamako, where he really felt this conversion of Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism, but also in Mopti, where he really just engaged in these really deep studies of West Africa's Muslim past. Just returned from that. It's in that context that he organized these conferences. And it makes sense, right? Like Black studies was never a strictly domestic endeavor. It wasn't never strictly about what was going on in the United States. In fact, the demand for Black studies came from students, who had largely engaged with the movements to democratize, to revolutionize, and to decolonize, not just the United States, but also the Third World. And indeed, Brown's conference widened the scopes of Black struggles from the domestic to the global. The two-day symposium that he organized was entitled Anger and Beyond, the Black Writer and the World in Revolution. And the proceedings that resulted from it, two long essays by Mercer Cook and Stephen Anderson, was entitled The Militant Black Writer in Africa and the United States. Brown was the one who had picked the two scholars that participated in that symposium that I just mentioned. And that also reflected his kind of orientation of, merging the domestic struggles with the global struggles. Stephen Anderson was a towering scholar of African-American literature and aesthetics. He was then the chair of the English department at Morehouse College. And within a few months, he would become a research scholar at one of the institutions that emerged out of these Black Studies riots. The Institute for the Black World in Atlanta. Mercer Cook, on the other hand, had lived in Cuba and Haiti, in Niger, and in Senegal, had translated several works by Black writers and politicians from French to English, including the Haitian Jacques Roumain and the Senegalese writers Mamadou Dia, Cheikh Anta Diop, Léopold Sédar Senghor. And so that was really Brown's attempt at fusing these two dynamics. The two scholars were also of different generations here. And that was Brown's attempt at, organizing this kind of space where they could sit in a room and, many people could attend and think together about the shape that these Black struggles, these global struggles in the Black world would take, but also in a way that really centered the scholarship that had been produced in all these various spaces. And that's important because Brown had come to Madison to study African history and African studies. And that means that, what that means is that he was also at the same time part of a very different type of intellectual space. That was the space of African studies that was emerging, well, not emerging, but that was present at the same time alongside Black studies, but in that period of the 1960s that had taken, different paths, these two sort of like enterprises. In that time period in the 60s, African studies in the United States was really becoming, or I guess had really become by now, something that was tethered to the Cold War needs for better diplomacy and relationship with emerging African nations. African studies was receiving state support, state funding, and was also an overwhelmingly white area of study. And so recognizing all these problems with the field of African studies, in the fall of 1968, at the annual meeting of the African Studies Association in Los Angeles, a group of scholars that called themselves the Black Caucus, had called upon the African Studies Association to change these politics. So it's very different types of dynamics that you see within the space that Brown is in, and that even, I don't have time to get into it now, but, involves people like his advisor at Wisconsin-Madison, who were really, really well established in the field of African studies with all these racial and political dynamics that you see. It's quite different from what he's trying to do as a student, the activities that he organizes independently. And you see that in a way he continues that, right? He finishes his thesis in 1969. And when he does that, instead of taking up a job immediately in the United States, what he does is follow the call of post-independence, politicians and scholars in Africa, in West Africa, including Kwame Nkrumah, who had stressed that African-centered knowledge should be produced out of African universities and African research centers. And that publications should be, African scientific production on Africa should probably come out of African journals. And so that's what Brown does, right? That's the kind of call that he heeds. In his dissertation, the only professional association that he lists himself as being a member of, is the Historical Society of Nigeria. The two journal publications that he's known for, aside for his PhD dissertation, his intellectual production on paper was rather thin, right? It was this dissertation that I showed, along with two very short articles that are kind of like reports from the field, reports on sources type thing. But he publishes them both from the research bulletin of the Center of Arabic Documentation of the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And upon finishing his PhD in August 1969, he goes on to join the faculty at Ahmadu Bello University in Nigeria, which was then a leading institution in the use of Arabic sources for writing African history. He will stay there not very long, for a few years, I believe, ends up coming back to the United States and eventually back to Madison, where he becomes a member of the faculty, initially alongside some of his former advisors, and then he will continue and stay there. And his scholarly production, kind of stops after that. There are no more publications by him. The dissertation is never transformed into a book. And his main contribution now occurs in the classroom. It takes the form of teaching, and the teaching goes in many different directions. Of course, focusing on these 19th century movements in West Africa, but also taking a deep interest in ancient Egypt, and really taking a deep, really taking his students to task and emphasizing the importance of really rigorous study of African history to fuel the politics of the moment and vice versa. And so, I mean, I'm gonna wrap up. Oh, I forgot to show this slide, which I wanted to show kind of like the trajectory that this work takes on later on. This is a friend and colleague of mine, Cheikh Giran, who teaches at the Senegalese scholar who teaches at the university in Martinique, saying that Aimé Césaire had this book in his home library that is still available now. And so it will be interesting to follow and to trace more what becomes the life of this work, if we're trying to think about the impact that Brown had on the field, and the impact is not technically well known outside of the group of people who look at West Africa in the 19th century, but maybe this is another kind of impact, right? Where else, who read this work? Where else did it go and find itself? And where else will it keep going? It's still available, and it's something that we can still, read and learn from a lot today. And so in conclusion, I just kind of want to bring it all together to reflect a little bit on the career and the trajectory of William Brown. Again, not a very well-known scholar outside of specific circles within West African history. And what that tells us. I came to Brown because I studied the history of 19th century West Africa, and so his dissertation is kind of one of these works that you will read if you're interested in the history of Islam in this region. And I'm embarrassed to admit it took me a few years to realize that this was not a white scholar, because everybody else I had read from that particular generation studying West African history and the history of Islam and the big names within the field were white scholars. And, when I first came across this work here, the militant Black writer, and again, you don't see his name on the cover, you don't see him like centered, but when you start reading literally the first page, you realize that this would not have come together were it not for him. And so he had that different kind of scholarly contribution. It was really hard for me to put together. I was like, these are two different Browns. Like I don't know this guy. I know the one who wrote the dissertation, not that one. How do the two come together? I think this is still an open question, right? I think it has a lot to do with, of course, the period that he came of age as a student. But something that I guess I want to center because it seems to have been really important to his trajectory, to his approach to West African history. Something that somebody like Wendell keeps emphasizing any day if you talk to Wendell, is something that Malcolm X told William Brown when they had an encounter in 1962 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is an anecdote that, that Brown recounted to several of his students later on, is that apparently, so in October 1962, so that was, I guess, in the second year of his graduate studies there, Malcolm came to give a talk at the University of Madison. And after his talk and his presentation, he took questions from the audience. At which point, William Brown, raised his hand and asked a particularly provocative question that was kind of meant to test Malcolm's knowledge of Islam. It was one of these really erudite, I don't know, maybe it was one of these questions that was more of a comment than a question, I don't know, but, that was kind of, that was kind of flexing his own intellectual muscle and testing the speaker, right? And Brown recalls that, as Malcolm was forming a response, he fixed, quote, his intense gaze upon Brown, looking sharply into his eyes. And Brown says that it felt as if he knew all kinds of things about me in that moment. And then Malcolm just asked if Brown was a Muslim. To which Brown responded, no. And indeed, he was a staunch atheist, Marxist atheist throughout his life. So Brown responded that no, he was not a Muslim, but rather that he was a student of Islam. To which Malcolm just responded, keep studying. So that keep studying, I think is something that really stayed with him for years and probably up to the end of his life. It's something that explains the kind of like really rigorous, really deep approach and emphasis that he puts on scholarship. Because indeed, you see that after that, in his trajectory, that indeed, he completely understands that a deep study of African history and a deep rigorous study of African history, and in that case of West African Muslim history, is one of the fuels for Black struggles in the US and globally. And that the two are intimately connected, even if it's not necessarily obvious at first glance. You see it in the other contributions. For example, before leaving for Mali, as he's still a graduate student, he co-authors a children's book that is titled Great Rulers of the African Past, that also, is meant to help kids. It's an illustrated book, understand better parts of the region of that, the history of that region, including the trajectories of, rulers like Mansa Musa, like Askia Mohammed, and so on and so forth. And the publisher that he publishes it with is a publisher, Zenith Books, that seeks to tap into knowledge of Africa's past to, provide a better foundation for political struggles in the United States. You see it also in the topic of study that he picks, right? As I was saying, that Muslim state, the Caliphate of Abdullahi in Mali is not the most studied, at least not in that time period, but frankly, even now, movement within 19th century West African history compared to others, right? Like compared to the Jihad of El Hadj Martal and other people. But he really goes there, and that's really what he decides to focus on. And Sean Honretta, who's a historian of West Africa, who was one student of William Brown back at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, explains that, in his opinion, what Brown believed was that those Muslim intellectuals who transmitted knowledge in 19th century West Africa are people who really believed that they could be internally damned if they knowingly recited falsehoods or committed falsehoods to paper. And that this instilled in them a profound commitment to empiricism and source criticism. And that's something that Brown himself really took on, right? That you see in the way that he teaches, in the way that he approaches the history of the region, and the way that also he then, really insists upon the necessity to acquire that knowledge literally to keep studying in fueling the struggles of the 1960s, both in West Africa and in the United States. So I think for me, this is it's very important to bring that back in the genealogy of what we know about the study of Islam in Africa and how it developed in this country, developed in other places, of course, and it's developed first and foremost in West Africa. But that's not an aspect of the genealogy, of the intellectual genealogy of the field that is often brought to the fore, and that's something that's very important, I think. And when we, bring it back to the theme of this, series, humanistic knowledge, what it means to be human, all of this, you see again, not just a different type of knowledge that these Muslim intellectuals in 19th century were pushing for and bringing about, but also the ramifications into the 1960s that, a young undergraduate student, pushed a young undergraduate student to decide to learn French and Arabic and to decide to undertake a PhD and do all of those things. And that maybe keep carrying on, because luckily we still study those places. We still try to understand those dynamics. And so I think, it's really helpful to look at his trajectory, to think of different intellectual genealogies, and to think about, just study on the one hand and political struggle on the other. I'm going to leave it here, and I guess we can, excited to talk and have more conversation about this. Thank you.
I think we can keep the discussion fairly open, and so if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions.
Yes, so I'm sorry I came in with like a little. Yeah, so I apologize for coming in late.
Yeah,
but
no worries.
What I meant was, so the studies, I wrote down here, like the African Black studies, that it was meant to be international. It was never like national.
Yes, yes, that is correct. That is correct. It was understood as a global struggle, not exclusively something that had to do with the United States, but also because if you look at what's going on in the 60s, revolutions in revolutionary politics in universities, for example, that's not something that's just going on in the United States, right? In many different parts of the world, you see it happen. You see it happen in France. You see it happen, in 1968 at the University of Dakar in Senegal. The students also take over, and they have very concrete demands. Decolonizing the university. It was still run by, very much ran from a French perspective and run by a French administration. Greater emphasis on student material conditions for students to be able to study and to work and to do all of this, but also changing the type of knowledge that is studied. So this is going on in universities across the world, but also in the United States. So it's important to understand it as part of this global dynamic.
And another thing, so how did Brown create, how did Brown was able to reach it to the global scale, in his readings and his writings?
In his readings and his writings?
Yeah. So how did he make the connection and to increase it, instead of it being a national, it's wait, this is a global level.
Yeah. I think we can't fully know, right? I think there's a lot of parts of his life that we don't necessarily, or not yet, know very well. But I feel like, in a sense, this distinction that we make between the U.S. and domestic struggles and what was going on outside of it is not necessarily something that was as present at the time. I think it was a lot more obvious for students in the 60s that this was not just about, that these national boundaries, that was not quite the thing. It became something that maybe as time passes and we're now in an entirely different context, we tend to think of these struggles as disconnected. But I think for that, just in the type of conversations that we're having, right? So I don't know if you were here, but I started off, he listened to a speech by Martin Luther King when he was a rising junior in college. MLK was just back from Ghana that had just become independent. And that was part of the type of speech, things that he told them. All these struggles were connected. The types of things that he was reading, the scholars that he was exposed to, and also just, in the 60s, news travels a lot. People see that basically there's stuff going on all over the place. A lot of countries in Asia and Africa fighting for decolonization or have just obtained decolonization. It's really a thing where I think it was really hard to miss, to answer your question. very specific, like at a basic level, it was hard to miss. And maybe it's us now with blind, with our own blind spots that tend to make this distinction between what was going on in the US and elsewhere. But they were not making it. Yes, I saw your hand. I saw your hand as well.
Let me see if I can, by any chance, make this work.
Sure.
Yes.
So first,
yeah, I'm sorry, because I haven't met most people in the room. I was wondering if,
my name is John Keene, and I chair Africana Studies here and also teach in the English department. So I just want to, first of all, thank you, Professor Thiam, for this wonderful talk. I mean, I thought it was, you brought so many things together, and it really got me thinking. As Professor Marsh Swindle mentioned, just a few years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of what was then the Department of African American and African Studies. And there was a conscious decision to add African studies and to ensure that the study of Africa, was part of our understanding of the department. We're now changing the name again. We're Afro-American Studies, and I think African Studies, then African American Studies, and African Studies, and now we're Africana Studies. I raise this because one of the things that I find really interesting now, sort of thinking about kind of online discourse, is on the one hand, I see a real concern for the idea of what is called, there's that fascinating book that came out just a few years ago, Black Study, which is a wonderful book, right? It theorizes the idea of Black study. And so I see there's a real interest in Black study and a real interest in complicated understandings of the relationships, the interrelationships within what we might call the larger Black world, right? What I also see, though, which is really interesting to me, is there are these sort of sectors, call anyone out, right? When we think about, like, there's the movement for foundational Black Americans and the ADOS folks, right? And some of this is in reaction to domestic politics. But I also think about, reading some of the work of the Afro-pessimists. When I think about Afro-pessimism itself, the book by Frank Wilderson III, he talks about his engagement with struggle outside the U.S. But then there is also a sense of, on the one hand, there's a very kind of theoretical model that sort of abstracts us from any specific space or place, right? Think about the fundamental foundational condition of anti-Blackness and its relationship to humanism, but also in interesting ways, a very U.S. focused understanding. And so I guess I'm trying to formulate this as a question, but I'm really curious to sort of think about like how in the person of someone like William Allen Brown, these connections are coming together, because as you point out, I mean, you mentioned Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very aware of, like, the global, not just global Black struggle, right? The global struggle, right? Peoples of color, right? I mean, his protests against the Vietnam War. Think about, of course, Malcolm X and his sense of globalism and Pan-Africanism, and any number of figures. And then even someone like Mercer Cook, who is just a really important person in terms of translation. Okay, so let me try to get to my question. So I guess my question is, could you just say a little bit more about, like, the foundational nature of what's happening in the work of someone like William Brown with his dissertation, and with the work that sort of stands alongside, as opposed to, because I want to say that alongside, outside the dissertation, the scholarly work, right? But that and this kind of symbiotic and dialectical relationship between the two of them, because I feel like this happens, and we see this in various ways in different figures, and here you have it, I think, kind of distilled beautifully in terms of something I have really seen, like African studies, but also Islamic studies, which is so interesting.
I mean, I think you put it better than I can, right? I feel like it's really inside the work. So if you take the example of Brown, and you go back, so had initially read the work just to learn more about West Africa, that part of West Africa, that dissertation solely in that context. I went back to the work, reading it again, reading the footnotes, or as we know, all the action happens. Reading all the things that are slightly around the work, but that really shows you again something really foundational, the context in which a work is produced. And there I really saw that, that symbiotic and dialectic relationship that you speak of in how you approach the work, in how you approached, the places that he chose to go to. So not just, okay, quick example. At that time period of the 60s, so he gets to Mali, that's where a lot of interest is picking up, including by UNESCO for what people refer to now as the Timbuktu manuscripts, meaning this whole, library of Arabic language and or Arabic script manuscripts produced in West Africa. And people like Abdoulaye Boularaf, which is one of the Timbuktu intellectuals that he interacts with, are really now courted by bodies like the UNESCO for access to the manuscript and for including like taking them, Brown said no. So Brown was offered to pay money for some of these manuscripts, the stuff that he was interested in, to just pay, and in order to be able to just take it and have it. He said no. That's not something that he, necessarily brags about. It comes up in other places. He spent a lot of time copying things. He spent a lot of time digitizing manuscripts. He's one of actually now there's a big effort to digitize all the whatever. He actually started doing that work from the 60s, but he purposefully, at a time when these conversations were not happening so much, said that if he accepts to do that, and that's something that his friend Maliki Yatara, he recounts in his memoirs, otherwise we wouldn't know that. But he says, if I accept to do that, to pay for essentially plundering the intellectual production of West Africa right now, not only would I open a door to more things like this happening, and then the actual scholarly work would no longer occur, right? And by the way, in a way, he was prophetic. Like we see now this whole almost business. I mean, I don't know, I have a lot of feelings about this whole Timbuktu manuscript. But this business of digitizing without actually reading or being interested in the content of said manuscripts. But also, and that's not just about manuscript, those are the debates that happen across the art world and intellectual world, like today, like the actual looting of African intellectual production. For me, that's one small interaction, right? It's a tiny thing that's not necessarily, it's not centered in the work again, but that to me also shows how he indeed embodies, as you were saying, preoccupations that stem not just out of this field of, like West African history, Islamic history, but also just thinking more broadly about, the political moment they're in, the place of Africa in the world, the place of intellectual pursuits in this political moment, and how he's not going to participate in that manner. And I find that super interesting. And I think there's a lot, because a lot of this could have easily been lost, and there's probably a lot more of that, right? Like I'm really interested in other figures that are not necessarily as well known as, Mercer Cook, like even William Brown, at least like within a small group of people. But I'm just curious now that we see us, as you were saying, all this online discourse that is it's all about cleavage, right? It's all about like, it's not, these things are, I think there's a lot more of these figures, right, that deserve to be brought to the fore. I think there was a lot more of that dynamic. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's just worth, I'm sorry, I'm not even sure I fully answered your question, but I think there is really something there, like, worth pursuing. All right. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, I'm trying to put this into more of a question, like a statement, but like, I just want to know your thoughts on like Brown's work still being contemporary today. Like, I almost view that kind of being sad, because in the 60s, we had these revolutionary moments, and then, imperialism, which is the highest form of capitalism from the Marxist point of view. And to see that happening again, so in 2020 and upwards to now, we've seen in West Africa other revolutions again, in Niger, Gambia, Mali, and Niger. So like, I don't know, I just want to know your thoughts on like the current day, the current state.
Okay. Well, as you're saying, right, like there's a lot of the dynamics that they were denouncing already, or identifying and denouncing already back then, and imperialism and the role it played in various parts of Africa, including the Sahel, that keep, you know, yeah, we're still in that. We're not in the same thing. I don't like also to talk about it as if, you know, as if things don't evolve or change or whatever. And there's a lot of things that happen in the meantime. I was talking about 1968. So when he, like, because Brown did his research in Mali on both sides of a very important moment, which is the coup that overthrows the first government of Mali. You know, that was a socialist government that had a lot more of this anti-imperialist orientation. You know, the government of Modibo Keïta that you know, got rid of the French army, initially allied with, at least attempted alliances with, you know, other countries, including Ghana and Guinea, like all of these. You really see that dynamic kind of like stopping in its tracks in the late 60s. And then there's, you know, then there are all the things that happen in the middle, including for the case of Mali, you know, really forceful and violent intervention by international organizations, the IMF, structural, what's the term I'm looking for? Structural adjustments policies that, again, to bring back together the political, but also the importance of studying, that really curtail, for example, the public funding that will go to education sector. And you saw some of these, you know, Malian universities, and I was talking about a bunch of Malian scholars who's really rising, you know, in the 60s, was really going to become also one of the intellectual powerhouses alongside other places. You see it happening in Nigeria, in Ghana. That stops, right? You know, these people that I was talking about in Mali, these intellectuals, they train another generation of scholars. But then after that, it's not to say that things have completely stopped, right? Like you do still have intellectual production coming out of Mali, but it's nothing as abundant as what you might have expected when you saw the state of, you know, scholarly production in, you know, in the 60s, what it could have been. So those are also other types of you know, interventions that you see happening in that space that continue to, you know, we continue to feel the impact today. And hopefully that's also something that's going to come out of the current political moment in the Sahel. I'm not necessarily convinced, but I hope it's something that will come out. Is also a re-emphasis on this, you know, on really valorizing the students, the scholars, you know, and putting at the center of, you know, what they're trying to do in terms of global politics, putting, you know, knowledge production at the center. Luckily, you have people like my colleague Siga Magiraga, you know, who are doing this work and who are writing these very important studies, you know, from Mali. So you know, I'm cautiously optimistic that some of that will reemerge. But yeah, as you're saying, you're right. I think you see the ramifications of what you're describing and the parallels. You see them very clearly and at many different levels, for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Totally fascinating. And as somebody who does not study West Africa, but comes from humanities interdisciplinary study, that was also really fascinating genealogy of the process. And so, well, one, as a director of a graduate program, I love that you have a dissertation page and talking about dissertations on foundational text that people are still reading in some field. One of my students or former students is now in the room, so that makes me feel good. To remind them that it matters. But two, Professor Brown's sort of life is basically spent as a teacher.
Yeah.
And seeing teaching and praxis and knowledge transmission, as you put it earlier, is so crucial to what he does and also to this global struggle. And so it has like a methods question really of like, you talked about, I wasn't sure if your distinction or his between sort of oral history and oral tradition, and how do you go about doing oral history with oral tradition, meaning, you know, oral history being interrogative, right? That you're asking questions and putting in context versus oral tradition, which is the transmission of a particular kind of knowledge over time and space, like a written text. So is he approaching it? So how do you do oral history with oral tradition, basically, is the question. Okay. And I have a second question about photography too, if we get to it, but
okay,
because that was really awesome too. I really like that.
Yeah, those pictures are cool. Okay, I think the distinction was mine. I didn't necessarily realize I did it. And I think what Brown does, in the way you characterize both, like the difference between oral history is oral history. Like he, if you listen to some of his former students, really put this emphasis to the point of really being like, one of these really harsh professors that you're like terrified of encountering, but at the same time, end up learning a lot from, on this really critical approach to oral sources that he considered at once really foundational. And clearly for his dissertation, it played a big role, right? Like he writes himself in his own study that, oral, I think he says oral tradition formed the backbone of the type of sources that he tried to collect, but the way he goes about analyzing them and critically analyzing them, he's doing that kind of oral history, right? And I think again, if you listen to his former student, that's something that was very much emphasized in the teaching. So there's and we can read about some of this. I'm less familiar now because, well, I didn't know him as a teacher, but just recently the Journal of African History put together a forum largely by people who had interacted with Brown as former graduate students, but also others. And so it's in that context that I wrote this piece. Here, if you go to if you can scan this barcode here, you can get to this forum that was put together, including by a number of like former students who recount their experiences with them, which seem to have been both transformative and terrifying, as I was saying. But that indeed that emphasis was really put. And what wonders, again, this is a discussion I was having with Wendell yesterday. To what extent, I mean, I think there's many factors that probably hindered the full blossoming of his intellectual production. I think he was a professor in a very complicated moment in African history and African studies, and he was one of the rare African-American scholars to do that, who was not sabotaged or pushed out of the field in one way or another. But also, I think also in his attempt to keep refining things to almost the point of perfection, that's what we were wondering yesterday with Wendell, like, did that not also just, lead him to not publishing it? And so, and it's great that, as you were saying, that we're reading a dissertation. I think it's dissertation are really important pieces of work. It's also nice when you can read them alongside the book and see like that difference. But for a number of reasons, he never got there. I think I'm forgetting, it might be included in one of the pieces, that at some point he was in conversation with a publisher, and I'm forgetting which one. There's a number of reasons why, this work was not transformed, which is a pity, which I think, I would like to see a version of, the story of what happened with Julius Scott, for example, and his dissertation, and it ended up, being published as is, or relatively as is. Something like that happened for this, book, because I think it's great that it exists as a dissertation, but I think it would also be good for it to be, kind of like more widely accessible. And I don't know, there's something about the dissertation not being turned into a book that's probably just my blind spot, because I'm in the middle of struggling with that right now. But I'm like, we need to see this book at some point.
I mean, it could be that publishing is also as racist as the university.
Yeah.
Throwing it out there. Oh, and I'm Kyle Reisman, I'm the director of American Studies.
And
sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I apologize.
Thank you. I think there was a question here, and then maybe afterwards we can take you said you had another one about, or we can chat.
I was really curious about the use of the photos. Was he taking them just for himself, or was this part of the broader practice, right? Because street photography, particularly in the United States, anyway, the civil rights movement, is visual culture being used to point out the hypocrisy of racism and white supremacy, probably most famously by Gordon Parks. And I was curious whether he saw this as another way to communicate this knowledge and these people in a way that was not maybe being published, or was able to get through the written word. Because as you pointed out, his dissertation reads, and I actually was curious whether he was white or not until you said that. The constraints of the dissertation, the format, probably forcing him into what was largely a kind of white way of reading African history that he had to conform to get the degree that he maybe didn't like. And that may be another explanation of why it's not published or was harder to translate. So I'm just curious what role the photographs played, and if he saw them as part of this larger global liberatory practice.
So short answer is, and here are some of the photos. So They're accessible just on this is the website of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Libraries. Yeah, I can circulate that link. Short answer to your question, I don't know, but I like the explanation you suggest. I really don't know actually. So I didn't know about these photographs for a long time. This was part of my attempt to find a picture of Bill. I actually have no idea what he looked like. So I emailed some of his former students yesterday. They were like, oh yeah, I might have a picture somewhere in some box. I'm not sure. Sean and Retta and Usman Kobo, who organized this whole forum around Brown. So I'm sure there are photographs of him, but I've struggled to find it. And so in my attempt, I went to the website of the library that was a few months ago and found those. And I didn't know about those, nor do I know how much they've circulated, maybe outside of Madison. I'm not sure. So I actually don't know what would have been it could be just documentation, right. But he handed them over also clearly for them to be preserved.
It felt like that. I guess when I saw it, that was like my immediate reaction of like, he's humanizing and sort of making this feel familiar in some way.
Very familiar.
Madina, could you click on the Weaver?
Sorry, what? The Weaver, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that feels like anthropological, right? Without the overtones.
For sure. Yeah, and you're thinking, right, I guess it occurs alongside, because he's also digitizing manuscripts. So there's another contribution by Mauro Nobili and Said Bouzbina in that forum that talks about the stuff he digitized, the material, the written materials he digitized, that I'm forgetting which university holds the digitized version of these manuscripts, which are publicly accessible. And now these two scholars have just done the work of like reordering them and making them more searchable. And so he's doing all of these things at the same time, right? So I don't know if it's and I don't know enough. I mean, I'm not a scholar of photography. I don't know enough about how to analyze it, but I really like the.
It's okay, Matt. No, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, me too. Awesome. Me too. Whether or not that was his intent, I think it certainly serves that purpose, right? I'm curious also who saw these photographs.
I mean, the quality of them are remarkable.
Right.
Yeah, just as photographs.
Yeah, from the 60s.
This is often like in postcards or other kind of like tokens of colonialism that get sold and trafficked, right? Like, there's a lot of work on this in sort of domestic space in the U.S. Like Laura Wexler's book, Tender Violence. Going on now, but
and it could be also as because indeed there is this whole archive about visual archive of West Africa, like of photographs, colonial era photographs, which I use a lot, which are also it's a very problematic archive also. And I wonder, it's a good question. I'm gonna stay on this. So thank you for giving me to think about, because this is indeed a question. Yeah.
So my name is Ryan. My professor is studying sociology of contemporary Islam, and I'm a Muslim student. So assalamu alaikum. So I was not here for most of the recitation, but I have so out of all the religions that Dr. Brown studied, what's Islam the most used one? Like, was there any other religions within in West Africa, and how did Islam made it impact or integrated within his theories or his thesis?
Yeah.
Can I follow that up?
Yeah.
So I think it's related, but why Alhamdulillahi specifically? And I think maybe that also helps get at this question.
And for the why, for both of these questions, there's a way in which we can only speculate up to a certain point, right? About why it's zeroed in. So first, why Islam? Because also his two advisors at Wisconsin-Madison were not working directly on that. One of them, to a certain extent, Philip Curtin, worked a little bit on that. No, not just a little bit. He worked on that region, on the Senegambia, but not on these, Muslim states and revolutionary movements. And then the other one, Jan Vencina, did not. But you see that Brown had other interlocutors who had been engaged in the study of these Muslim states in 19th century West Africa. there were several people studying that at the same time or looking at it, including Walter Rodney, for example, the Guyanese intellectual, who's intellectual and revolutionary, who's known for other things. But for example, he also publishes a journal article about another Muslim state in Futa Jallo. But why Islam? Yeah, I feel like to a way. So outside of the basic generic response, which is this, it's an area of study that people were really interested in at the time. This in the 19th century, these reshaping of the geography of the region and of state making in West Africa by Muslim leaders. Many of them were Muslim revolutionary leaders. So you have like a kind of broader scholarly interest in that still exists. Why did he pick that? That's where I start entering the realm of speculation, or maybe informed speculation based on the way Brown seems to have approached study. Like, yeah, I mean, okay, I feel like I'm going to start sounding like Wendell now, but the love of study, yeah, no. It's not the worst thing, but we don't need to go there. Yeah. Maybe it had to do with, these people who led these revolutionary movements in West Africa and United States were equal part, for many of them, equal part scholars, equal part political leaders. Mm-hmm. And they put equal emphasis on both. Maybe this is a parallel he identified of something that was necessary for his contemporary moments. And Malcolm told him to keep studying anyways, but also, he was a student, but he was attending and interested in all these political movements, attending these talks. Maybe he identified another historical moment where, a group of people are able to completely reshape what a certain region looks like, reshape a number of dynamics. It's a short-lived movement when you look at the broader arc of things, right? Like the broader history. But they put this, finding, this political aspect and the intellectual aspect side by side. Like it's not just not side by side. They're part of one. Like it's unthinkable to do one without the other. Maybe this is something that he identified as necessary, from where he was standing in Kentucky and North Carolina and New York and Madison. But I'm speculating. Why Hamdullah? Yeah, that I'm really not sure. Part of it could have to do with, you're doing you're starting off dissertation and you're interested in a broader topic, and then you want to zero in on something that has been less studied and it had been less studied at the time. And perhaps that's what drew him initially to that. As opposed to studying, Usman Danfodio and what was going on in what was in Nigeria, or what had gone on, in what was in Nigeria, or Elhaj Omar. So I'm sure this kind of lesser studied aspect played a part. Like you have to be pragmatic when you write a dissertation. That might have played a part. At a deeper and more like substance, at a level more of substance, did you identify something in the figure of the, both in the figure of Sekou Amadou, like the first, the founding ruler of this Muslim state, but also the kind of enterprise that they tried to bring about? Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to go there, but I feel like maybe you are. And that's why you're asking.
Well, I don't mind speculation as much. So one thing also to respond to your question, I think it's important to recognize at least two traditions of Islamic studies in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Like one is Orientalist, full stop, right? Which is aligned with power and colonial power and interests, right? Then there's another tradition of Islamic studies, which really comes out of a almost popular kind of Black intellectual tradition, which some people have described as Orientalist as well, but that doesn't accurately reflect the fact that a lot of these folks weren't necessarily aligned with the colonial project, right? So if you take people, whether it's Brown or even Edward Blyden, who is often thought of as the kind of godfather of Pan-Africanism, he was literally a Christian missionary, right? But he identifies in Haj Omar, who establishes another state like Hamdulahi. He recognizes this as an important example of the African personality, what becomes a really important concept for defining Pan-Africanist thought. And so the history of Islam in West Africa in the 18th and 19th century, the way in which it reflected a popular revolutionary movement against the predation of the transatlantic slave trade and eventually the encroachment of the colonial state, actually becomes a really important resource for thinking for African Americans, Muslim and non-Muslim. And so I think that this tradition, tradition of the study of Islam in an American context, which isn't necessarily Orientalist in the way that we traditionally mean it, I think this is an example of that. But also, I think Hamdulahi specifically, if we believe someone like Amadou Hampete Ba and his depiction of Madina and the importance of what was essentially a parliament, right, in the Dina, where, you know, the council of 40 elders, like these are actually models for political thought. And whether it's the Songhai Empire or the Mauryan state or Madina, these are all examples in which there was alternative resources and references for thinking sovereignty, for thinking political structure that weren't associated with colonial rule, but that seemed to be some kind of alternative. Now, we can debate that about the extent to which that was true or accurate, but I think for a lot of people, especially in the 50s and the 60s, outside of the African-American Muslim context, which is yet another very important context, you know, Islam was very important as a kind of a reference, resource, and in some cases, model for thinking how to live.
I think with that, unless you want to say something else, actually, I'll give you the last word if you want to, and then we will thank for this wonderful, wonderful discussion.
I'll leave the last word with Malcolm. Keep studying.
Thank you so much.